The air inside the grand reception hall was electric with joy. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the elegantly decorated space, where guests, in their finest attire, clinked glasses and laughed over lavishly plated dinners. It was the perfect celebration for what seemed to be the perfect couple, Natalie and James. She, a stunning bride in a lace-trimmed gown, radiant and graceful. He, a confident and devoted groom, standing tall beside her, his eyes filled with nothing but love. Their love story had all the makings of a fairy tale, one that had just reached its happiest chapter. Or so everyone thought. Because beneath the carefully curated smiles and the shimmering perfection of this night, a dark secret lurked, one that, once revealed, would shatter lives forever. The speeches had been heartfelt, the toasts warm and full of admiration. But as the evening went on, something changed. A hush fell over the room as an unexpected guest made their way onto the stage. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Who was this person? They weren't on the guest list. And why did they look so determined, almost vengeful? Natalie's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her champagne flute, her eyes darting to James, who had yet to notice the shift in energy. The stranger cleared their throat, tapping the microphone. What they said next sent shockwaves through the room. Gasps echoed. A collective disbelief took hold. The music stopped. Silverware clattered onto plates. And just like that, the fairy tale came crashing down. James's expression shifted from confusion to anger, his jaw tightening as the weight of the revelation sank in. Guests exchanged anxious glances, some covering their mouths in shock, others inching forward, eager to catch every word of the unfolding scandal. But Natalie looked frozen. Her perfect bridal glow had faded into something ghostly pale. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, to explain, to deny. But there was no stopping what had been set into motion. And as James took slow, deliberate steps toward her, the entire room held its breath. No one could have predicted what would happen next. But before anyone could intervene, before anyone could process the gravity of the moment disaster struck, the moment felt frozen in time. The grand reception hall, once alive with laughter and celebration, now simmered with an eerie tension. James's fingers twitched at his sides, his body rigid, his eyes locked onto Natalie with an expression no one had ever seen before, an expression that sent a shiver through the crowd. The stranger on the stage stood firm, their face a mask of quiet satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The weight of their revelation pressed down on the room like a suffocating fog, leaving guests shifting in their seats, exchanging worried glances. Some reached for their phones, whispering frantically, while others sat motionless, unwilling to miss a second of the unfolding chaos. Natalie, usually so poised, so effortlessly in control, suddenly looked small, like a cornered animal trapped in the spotlight. But why? What had been said that had turned this magical night into a waking nightmare? In the weeks leading up to the wedding, nothing had seemed out of the ordinary, at least not to anyone who wasn't looking closely. Natalie had been the picture of an excited bride, organizing final details with meticulous care. Her social media flooded with posts about love, new beginnings, and the perfect life she and James were about to share. But beneath the surface, cracks had already started to form. There were moments when she seemed distracted. When she thought no one was watching, she would stare off into the distance, her smile faltering, her fingers tapping anxiously against her phone. Late-night phone calls that she always took in hushed tones, disappearing into another room. The tension in her shoulders when she read certain text messages, deleting them almost instantly. And then, there was that one night, just a week before the wedding, when she had come home hours later than she should have. Her dress slightly wrinkled, the scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to her skin. James had asked her where she had been, and her response had been quick, rehearsed. Too rehearsed. James, on the other hand, had never been one to doubt Natalie. He adored her. He trusted her completely. At least, he had. His friends had tried to warn him subtle comments, off-handed remarks about how no one was really that perfect, how every love story had its secrets. But James had laughed it off, unwilling to entertain the idea that Natalie could ever be anything but his perfect bride. After all, she had chosen him. And yet, standing there in that moment, his heart pounding in his chest, something inside him twisted violently, telling him that he had been a fool. The look in Natalie's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she refused to meet his gaze, it told him everything he needed to know. But he didn't want to believe it. The guests weren't sure what to do, some gripping their champagne glasses, others clutching onto their partner's arms. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Had someone from Natalie's past come to destroy her happiness? Was this a mistake, an act of jealousy, or something far worse? And then there were whispers about James himself. Could he have known something before tonight? Was his love for Natalie blind, or was he hiding something too? The room pulsed with uncertainty, the walls closing in as the revelation settled into the minds of everyone present. And yet, the most terrifying part of it all was that no one knew what was coming next. Because James wasn't just hurt, he was furious. And in the next breath, before anyone could move, before anyone could stop what was about to happen, he acted. A suffocating silence gripped the room as James took a step closer to Natalie, his face a storm of disbelief and fury. The guests sat frozen, watching the unraveling of a love story they had come to celebrate just hours before. But before James could utter another word, before Natalie could attempt to defend herself, the microphone let out a sharp burst of static. The stranger on stage leaned forward, as if about to say more, but then, without warning, the sound system cut off completely. The lights flickered. A sudden gasp rippled through the room as the chandeliers above them dimmed for just a second before glowing back to full brightness. It was as if the very atmosphere had been shaken, as if something or someone was trying to halt what was about to unfold. And then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, the stranger turned and disappeared into the crowd, vanishing before anyone could stop them. James spun around, scanning the sea of guests, but the mysterious figure was gone. His breath came in ragged bursts, his chest rising and falling with barely contained rage. He needed answers. Now. But as he turned back to Natalie, she was no longer standing where he had left her. She was slipping away through the side doors of the reception hall, her white dress trailing behind her like a ghost in the night. Without thinking, James pushed through the stunned crowd and followed, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. What had just happened? Who was that person? And more importantly, what were they talking about? As he stepped into the dimly lit corridor beyond the ballroom, James's pulse pounded in his ears. He spotted Natalie just ahead, moving quickly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Natalie," he called out, his voice sharper than he intended. She flinched, but didn't stop. Instead, she turned a corner and disappeared into a private lounge area meant for the wedding party. When James reached the door, he hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open. Inside, Natalie stood near a leather sofa, her back to him, one hand gripping the edge of a small table as if to steady herself. She didn't turn around. "Who was that?" James demanded, his voice low but urgent. And what did they mean? For a long moment, Natalie said nothing. The tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate. Then, finally, she exhaled a shaky breath. "I don't know," she whispered, but there was something in her voice, something hesitant, something not quite right. James narrowed his eyes. He had known her for years. He knew when she was lying. Before he could press her further, a sharp knock rattled the door. Both of them tensed. James turned, expecting to see a concerned guest or a member of the wedding staff. But instead, a man in a dark suit stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. James had never seen him before. The man's gaze flicked between them before settling on Natalie. "This isn't the time or place," he said firmly, his tone calm but laced with quiet authority. "We should talk somewhere private." James bristled. "Who the hell are you?" Natalie turned then, her eyes wide with something that looked alarmingly close to fear. "James, please," she said quickly. "Just let it go." Let it go. After what had just happened. After everything that had been said. That wasn't an option. But before James could argue, the man in the suit reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. He held it up between two fingers. "There's more to this than you realize," he said, his gaze locked onto James. "But if you keep pushing, you might not like what you find." James's blood ran cold. Everything in him screamed to snatch the drive, to demand answers, to get to the bottom of whatever the hell was going on. But then, just as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone. The man tucked the drive back into his pocket and turned to leave. "Think carefully," he said over his shoulder before disappearing down the hall. James stood there, his heart hammering, his mind spinning in 100 different directions. What was on that flash drive? And why was Natalie so afraid of him finding out? But what James didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that the truth wasn't just dangerous. It was deadly. James stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, his mind racing as the sound of the man's footsteps faded into the distance. His pulse pounded in his ears, his instincts screaming at him to chase after the stranger, to demand answers, to rip that flash drive from his hands and uncover whatever truth had just been dangled in front of him like bait. But before he could move, before he could even fully process what had just happened, Natalie placed a hand on his arm, gentle, trembling. "James, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't do this." He jerked away from her touch. The betrayal burned too hot, too fresh. "Don't do what, Natalie?" He hissed, his voice low and sharp. "Find out why my own wife is standing here, looking like she's just seen a ghost. Figure out what the hell was just exposed in front of everyone we know." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration clawing at his chest. "Or should I just smile, pretend everything's fine, and go back in there like nothing happened?" Natalie's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, her shoulders slumped, her entire body seeming to deflate. She looked exhausted, haunted. "There are things you don't understand," she finally murmured. "Things I can't explain." "Not yet." James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Not yet? That's all you've got?" His fists clenched at his sides, as anger warred with something else, something much worse. A gnawing sense of dread. "Tell me the truth, Natalie. Because right now, I don't even know who I married." Before she could answer, James's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. The sound startled them both, the sudden noise cutting through the tense silence like a knife. He hesitated before pulling it out, his stomach tightening when he saw the caller ID. Chris. His best man. His closest friend since college. The one person who had stood by him through everything. James swiped to answer. "Chris?" There was no greeting, no small talk, just sharp, panicked breathing on the other end. Then Chris's voice, urgent and strained. "James, I just got something. A text. I don't know what the hell is going on, but you need to see this." James's throat went dry. "What kind of text?" There was a pause. Then Chris lowered his voice. "A video. From an unknown number." Something cold crawled down James's spine. "What's in it?" Chris hesitated, and that hesitation alone told James everything he needed to know. "It's about Natalie," Chris finally admitted. "And it's bad, man. Real bad." James felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His grip tightened around his phone. "Send it to me. Now." "I already tried," Chris said quickly. "But here's the thing, it won't go through. It keeps disappearing, like it's being erased the second I try to forward it." He exhaled sharply. "James, you need to get over here. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep it." James barely heard Natalie's voice behind him. "What's happening?" she asked softly, but he couldn't tear his focus away from the sinking feeling in his gut. This wasn't just about what had happened tonight. This was bigger, deeper. "I'm on my way," James told Chris before ending the call. He turned to Natalie, his expression unreadable. "Whatever's going on, it's not just happening here," he said, his voice low. "Chris just got something. A video. About you." Natalie's face went ghostly pale. "James, you don't understand." But James had already made up his mind. He wasn't waiting for more lies. He wasn't standing still while secrets swallowed his life whole. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the hallway, pushing past the reception doors and into the night. The truth was out there, and he was going to find it no matter the cost. What James didn't know was that he wasn't the only one searching, and he certainly wasn't the only one being watched. The night air was thick with humidity as James pushed through the doors of the reception hall, his pulse hammering in his ears. The contrast between the warmth of the ballroom and the coolness outside hit him all at once, but he barely noticed. His mind was a storm, torn between the shock of what had just happened and the urgency of getting to Chris. Whatever was on that video, whatever truth had been buried beneath lies and half-truths, he had to see it for himself. But something gnawed at him, a deep, unsettling feeling that had nothing to do with betrayal and everything to do with the creeping sense that he was stepping into something far more dangerous than a simple wedding scandal. His car was parked near the back of the venue, away from the main entrance where guests were still gathered in clusters, whispering about the spectacle they had just witnessed. James moved quickly, his eyes darting around the lot, the weight of his thoughts making every sound, every rustle of leaves, every distant footstep seem louder than it should be. As he reached for the car door handle, a chill ran through him. That feeling, the one that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the one that tells you someone is watching. James turned sharply, scanning the lot. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching toward him like grasping fingers. The only movement came from the faint flicker of a neon sign across the road. But the feeling didn't go away. His breathing was heavier now, his fingers tightening around the car keys. He wasn't imagining it. Someone was there. He yanked the door open and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors out of instinct. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for a split second, he swore he saw something, a shadow, shifting at the far end of the lot, disappearing behind a row of parked cars. His heart slammed against his ribs. He wasn't alone. With a sharp breath, James started the car, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to focus. Paranoia wasn't going to help him right now. He had to get to Chris. He threw the car into reverse, stealing one last glance at the mirrors. Nothing. But that didn't mean no one was there. The drive to Chris's place was only 15 minutes, but every second felt stretched. The road ahead, an endless tunnel of headlights and shadows. The city felt different tonight, emptier, quieter, like something was lurking just beneath the surface. James kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car following too closely, a pair of headlights that never turned off his path. But there was nothing. Just the hum of his tires against the pavement and the distant wail of a siren somewhere in the city. When he finally pulled up outside Chris's apartment, his stomach twisted at what he saw, or rather, what he didn't see. The front door was open. Not wide, just slightly ajar, like someone had left in a hurry or had been forced to. The warm glow from inside spilled onto the front steps, flickering slightly, as if the light inside had been disturbed. James killed the engine and climbed out, his movements slow, deliberate. His body was screaming at him to be careful. Something wasn't right. "Chris?" he called out, stepping onto the porch. No answer. The silence was worse than if someone had shouted back, He pushed the door open the rest of the way, stepped inside. The apartment was eerily still, but nothing was out of place at least, not at first glance. The TV was on, casting a muted blue glow across the walls. A half-empty beer sat on the coffee table. Everything looked normal, untouched. But Chris was nowhere in sight. James's gut twisted. "Chris," he called again, louder this time. He took a few careful steps inside, his breath shallow. Then he saw the phone. Chris's phone, lying face up on the kitchen counter, its screen still lit. A message notification. James walked toward it, his heart thudding with every step. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the screen. One unread message. From an unknown number. "You were warned." James's blood ran ice cold. A sharp creak from behind him made his entire body go rigid. The air shifted. Someone else was here. And before James could react, before he could even turn to see who it was, the lights flickered once, then cut out completely, plunging the apartment into total darkness. James's breath came in short, ragged bursts as the darkness swallowed the room. His grip on Chris's phone tightened, his pulse hammering against his skull. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence thick enough to suffocate. But then, somewhere in the shadows, a slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Soft but intentional. Someone was here. Someone was moving toward him. His instincts screamed at him to run, to move before it was too late, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. The air felt different, heavier, as if the room itself had closed in around him. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Chris was gone, his phone left behind with a chilling message. The open door, the flickering lights, none of it was coincidence. Then, a voice broke the silence. Low, familiar. James. His entire body stiffened. He turned toward the voice, barely able to make out the figure standing in the darkness. The faint glow from the TV flickered just enough to reveal part of their face, and James felt the floor drop out from under him. His stomach twisted into a knot so tight it felt like he was being strangled from the inside. Natalie. She stood there, her white dress now wrinkled and stained at the hem, her eyes wide and unreadable. But she wasn't alone. A second figure stepped into the dim light, and James's breath caught in his throat. The man from the wedding. The one with the flash drive. The one who had warned him to stop digging. James took a step back, his mind a blur of confusion and disbelief. What the hell is going on? His voice came out harsher than he intended, but he didn't care. He wanted answers. Needed them. And right now, all he could see was his wife standing in the middle of his best friend's apartment with the one person who had tried to shut him up. Natalie exhaled slowly, as if she had been preparing for this moment. "James, listen to me. You don't understand." "I think I understand plenty," he shot back, his chest tightening with every word. "Chris is missing. His phone is sitting right here with a threat on it. And now you show up with him?" He gestured toward the man, whose expression remained infuriatingly calm. "After everything that just happened tonight." Natalie flinched, but she didn't back down. "Chris isn't missing." James narrowed his eyes. "What?" The man finally spoke, his voice smooth, controlled. "Your friend knew too much. He put himself in the middle of something that had nothing to do with him." His gaze locked onto James, with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "So we moved him." James felt his blood turn to ice. His fingers twitched with the urge to lash out, to grab this man by the collar and demand answers. But something about the way Natalie was looking at him stopped him cold. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't pleading. She was resigned. Like this had been inevitable. He swallowed hard. "Where is he?" Natalie hesitated for only a second. "Safe. For now." James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Safe? You think I'm just going to take your word for that?" You're standing here with the guy who just threatened me at my own wedding. Who are you, Natalie? His voice cracked slightly at the end, and that was what scared him most of all. The woman he thought he knew, his wife, felt like a stranger now. Natalie's lips parted, her expression wavering for the first time. But it was the man who answered instead. "You've been looking at this all wrong, James," he said evenly. "You think this is about a wedding scandal. About some deep, dark secret Natalie was hiding from you." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. But the truth, it was never about her. James felt his breath hitch. "What are you talking about?" The man tilted his head, studying him. "You're asking the wrong questions." His voice dropped slightly, sending a chill down James's spine. "Who do you think this was all for?" James's stomach twisted violently. He had spent the entire night trying to uncover what Natalie had been hiding. He had chased shadows, followed breadcrumbs, convinced that the mystery revolved around her. But now, standing in this darkened apartment, staring at his wife and the man who had tried to silence him, a horrifying thought took root in his mind. What if this wasn't about Natalie at all? What if it had been about him? Before he could process that terrifying possibility, the room was flooded with red and blue lights. A single distant wail of a police siren pierced the night, and James barely had time to react before the pounding of footsteps filled the hallway outside. The front door burst open, and in that moment, everything changed. The moment the police stormed into the apartment, chaos erupted like a bomb, detonating in slow motion. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams bouncing off the walls, illuminating the confusion on James's face, the unreadable tension in Natalie's expression, and the cold, calculated stillness of the man beside her. Officers shouted commands, their voices sharp and urgent, but James barely heard them over the pounding in his ears. His mind was already spiraling, unraveling in a way that left him grasping for any shred of certainty. Then, before he could react, he felt the cold, unmistakable clamp of handcuffs locking around his wrists. The metal bit into his skin as rough hands yanked his arms behind his back. His body stiffened, shock crashing over him in waves. "Wait, what the hell is this?" His voice came out hoarse, breathless. He turned his head, desperately searching for an explanation, for any sign that this was some kind of mistake. But the officers weren't looking at him. They weren't even focused on Natalie or the man beside her. They were looking at the body. James's stomach lurched violently as his eyes followed their gazes. And there, sprawled on the floor just beyond the kitchen island, was Chris. Motionless, his face pale beneath the flickering TV light. Blood smeared along the hardwood in thick, dark streaks. His shirt was torn, his fingers curled inward, as if they had been clutching at something in his final moments. James felt the air leave his lungs. His entire body locked up, his brain screaming at him to move, to do something, but he couldn't. He was paralyzed by the sheer horror of it. "This isn't," his voice cracked as he turned back to Natalie, to the man still standing beside her. "Tell them I didn't do this." His words were desperate, raw. "Natalie, tell them." But she didn't speak. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on the floor, her hands trembling at her sides. That was when James realized something even worse than the fact that he was being arrested. Natalie wasn't surprised. She had known. James felt the world tilt beneath him, his breath catching in his throat. None of this made sense. Chris was alive just minutes ago. He had just been speaking to him. He had just told James to come here. And now this? How? And why the hell wasn't Natalie saying anything? The officer holding him pulled him toward the door, his grip tight and unrelenting. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer's voice droned distantly, as if coming from underwater. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." "No," James snapped, his voice rising. "This is wrong. I didn't do this." His entire body fought against the hold, panic overriding any sense of control. "Natalie, look at me. Say something." Finally, she lifted her head. Their eyes met, and for the first time since the night had started unraveling, James saw something in her gaze that made his blood run cold. Regret. Not fear. Not shock. Not confusion. Just regret. His chest tightened as the reality settled deep in his bones. Whatever was happening, whatever game had been playing out behind his back, it had been leading here all along. And Natalie had known. Maybe not everything. Maybe not the extent of it. But she had known enough. The man beside her finally spoke, his voice smooth, eerily calm. "This isn't the end, James." His lips curled into something that might have been a smirk, though there was no amusement behind it. "This is just the beginning." The words barely had time to register before James was shoved forward, pulled out the door and into the flashing sea of red and blue lights. But as they dragged him toward the waiting squad car, a new thought began creeping into his mind, chilling him from the inside out. If Chris had been killed before James even arrived, then who the hell had texted him to come here? And worse, who else was waiting in the shadows, pulling the strings? The door slammed shut behind him, locking him inside. And for the first time in his life, James realized the truth wasn't just dangerous. It was deadly. The squad car lurched forward, its engine humming beneath James as he sat rigid in the back seat, his mind a tangled mess of disbelief and raw, seething anger. His wrists ached from the tight metal cuffs, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. Chris was dead. He had been set up, and Natalie, his wife, the woman he had promised his life to, had stood there and let it happen. She had looked him in the eyes and said nothing. The city lights blurred past the window as the car sped through the streets, the sirens now silenced, leaving only the low crackle of the police radio filling the air. James's breath was uneven, his thoughts racing too fast to catch. None of this made sense. If he was being framed for Chris's murder, that meant someone had planned this. Carefully, methodically. It wasn't just about ruining his wedding or exposing Natalie's secret. This was deeper, bigger, and whoever was behind it had been steps ahead of him from the start. A sudden vibration against his leg made his entire body tense. His phone. It was still in his pocket. The officers hadn't searched him yet. He shifted slightly, feeling the shape of the device pressing against the fabric of his pants. Then, another vibration. A message. His heart pounded. No one should be texting him. His name was probably all over the news by now. His face splashed across headlines as a suspected murderer, who would still be reaching out. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay still, to think. He had to get out of here. He had to find out who had just messaged him. Then, as if fate had heard his silent plea, the squad car suddenly swerved to the right, tires screeching against the pavement. The driver barked a curse, fighting for control as the car veered toward a narrow alley. And then impact. A sickening crunch of metal against metal as another vehicle rammed into them from the side, sending the squad car spinning. James's body slammed against the door, the seatbelt digging into his chest as chaos erupted around him. The front windshield shattered, glass spraying forward, the officers in the front seat shouting in confusion. The world tilted violently, a blur of flashing lights, screeching tires, and the deep metallic groan of a car losing its battle against gravity. And then stillness. For a moment, everything went quiet, the distant wail of sirens now muffled by the ringing in James's ears. He forced his eyes open, blinking through the haze. The squad car was on its side, the front end crushed where it had hit a lamppost. The officers in the front seat weren't moving. Then, footsteps. Fast. Purposeful. Getting closer. Panic surged through James's veins as he twisted against the cuffs, his breathing shallow and erratic. He could barely move, his body trapped against the seat. He needed to get out. Now, the back door wrenched open with a violent jerk, the night air rushing in. A figure loomed over him, face obscured by the glare of the streetlight. Then, a gloved hand reached inside, grabbed him by the collar, and yanked him out. James hit the pavement hard, gasping as the wind was knocked out of him. Before he could react, the cold blade of a knife sliced through the plastic binding his wrists, freeing his hands in one swift motion. "Get up," a voice hissed. Urgent. Familiar. James looked up, his vision swimming. His heart nearly stopped. Chris. Alive? James's stomach twisted so violently he nearly doubled over. This wasn't possible. He had seen the blood, the lifeless body. He had felt the weight of his own grief crushing him only minutes ago. And yet, here Chris was, very much alive, very much breathing, his expression grim and tense. "We don't have time," Chris said, grabbing James by the arm and hauling him to his feet. "They're coming." James barely had time to process the words before he saw movement at the far end of the street, figures emerging from the darkness, their silhouettes sharp against the glow of approaching headlights. Men in suits. Moving fast. Too organized to be cops. Too dangerous to be ignored. Chris shoved something into his hands. A phone. Not his. A different one. "Drive," he ordered, nodding toward a black sedan parked just feet away, engines still running. James's hands were shaking, his mind still trying to catch up, but he didn't argue. His survival instincts kicked in, and within seconds, he was behind the wheel, Chris sliding into the passenger seat beside him. The men behind them started running. James slammed his foot onto the gas. The tires screeched, the engine roared, and within moments, they were tearing through the streets, headlights blurring as the city streaked past them. Adrenaline pumped through James's veins, his grip white-knuckled on the wheel. His mind was a battlefield of questions, doubts, and sheer disbelief. Chris was alive. Someone had staged his death, and now James was running for his life. Chris exhaled sharply, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. Then he turned back to James. His expression was dark, hollow. "You were never supposed to find out." James's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "Find out what?" Chris hesitated. Then he exhaled. This wasn't about Natalie. It was never about her. His jaw clenched. It was about you. James felt his stomach drop. He had heard those words before back in the apartment, from the man who had stood beside Natalie. He had dismissed them then, too, caught up in the betrayal, the fear. But now, with Chris sitting beside him, with his own best friend somehow resurrected from the dead, it all felt too real. Chris turned to him, his eyes full of something James couldn't quite place, guilt maybe, or something even darker. "You're the loose end, James." And just like that, everything he thought he knew shattered all over again. The night air was thick with gasoline and sweat, the distant wail of sirens, swallowed by the pounding of James's own pulse. The black sedan screeched to a stop outside the abandoned warehouse, on the outskirts of town, its rusted walls bathed in flickering orange from a single hanging floodlight. James's knuckles were bloodless against the steering wheel, his breath shallow, his mind teetering between rage and dread. Chris sat motionless beside him, his expression unreadable, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them like a loaded gun. For the past 20 minutes, James had driven with his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the wheel like a man possessed, replaying every lie, every betrayal, every moment that had led him here. His wife, his best friend, the staged death, the cryptic warnings, and now Chris's words echoing in his skull. It was never about her. It was about you. James swallowed hard. He wasn't leaving this place without the truth. They climbed out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes, barely audible over the rapid beat of his heart. The warehouse loomed ahead, its steel doors slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for them. Chris motioned for James to follow, his movements rigid with something James couldn't quite place: hesitation, maybe, or guilt. Inside, the air was stale, laced with the faint scent of motor oil and something more metallic. Blood? James wasn't sure. The space was cavernous, empty except for a few wooden crates stacked against the far wall, and a single chair positioned under the floodlight. And standing next to it, waiting, was the man James had last seen in his apartment, the one who had whispered, "This is just the beginning," as James had been dragged away in handcuffs. The man smirked as James stepped forward. "You're finally catching up," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Took you long enough?" James's hands curled into fists. "Tell me what the hell this is about." Chris exhaled, stepping beside him. "James, listen. No more games." James's voice was raw, barely controlled. "You faked your death. You let me believe I killed you. You let Natalie's throat tightened, but he forced the words out. You let her do this to me." Chris's jaw twitched. "I had no choice." James let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Bullshit." His eyes flicked back to the man. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The man stepped closer, his smirk deepening. "The truth," he said simply. "And by now, you must have figured out that the truth isn't about Natalie's affair or some petty revenge." He tilted his head. "It's about who you really are." James stiffened. A cold chill spread through his spine. "What are you talking about?" Chris exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "James, you're not who you think you are." The words hit like a hammer to the chest. James's body went rigid, his mind rejecting the sentence before it could fully register. His lips parted, but nothing came out. The man's gaze sharpened. "Think about it," he pressed. "Think about why your whole life has been easy. Why doors always open for you. Why people in power seem to owe you favors. Why Natalie's betrayal wasn't about love, it was about access." James's head was spinning. His past unraveled in front of him in jagged pieces, his meteoric rise in business, the way high-profile connections had come effortlessly, the strange moments where people had seemed almost afraid of him without reason. Then the final blow landed. Chris swallowed hard. "Your real name isn't James Carter." Silence. James felt his knees buckle. "No," he whispered. Chris nodded. "Your father, he wasn't just some corporate tycoon. He was involved in things. Dangerous things. Things you were never supposed to find out about. And when he died, people made sure his secrets died with him, including you." James felt like he couldn't breathe. "You were given a new identity," Chris continued. "A new life. The people who did it made sure you'd never ask questions. But then, someone started digging. And when Natalie got close, when she realized who you really were," Chris hesitated. "They had to intervene." The warehouse blurred. James staggered back, his pulse hammering like a war drum. "Natalie married me to control you," the man finished smoothly. "She wasn't just some cheating wife, James. She was part of this. She was watching you, keeping you in check." James's stomach twisted violently. "You were never meant to wake up," the man continued, his tone almost pitying. "You were meant to live your life in blissful ignorance, oblivious to the blood on your family's hands." He exhaled. "But now you know. And that makes you a liability." The weight of it all crushed down on James, the sheer magnitude of the deception suffocating him. He had spent his entire life believing he was ordinary, that his successes and failures were his own, that the woman he loved had simply betrayed him for another man. But this was beyond betrayal. This was a carefully constructed lie that had unraveled in the worst possible way. He had spent his entire life following the script someone else had written for him. Not anymore. James moved before he could think, lunging forward, grabbing Chris's wrist, twisting the gun free. The other man reacted fast, raising his weapon, but James was faster. The shot rang out before the thought even fully formed. And then, silence. Chris's eyes widened as he staggered back, blood blooming against his shirt. His lips parted in shock before he crumpled to the floor. James turned the gun on the last man standing, his grip steady despite the adrenaline shaking through his veins. "I'm done running," he said coldly. The man's smirk faded. For the first time, James saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Fear. And that's when James realized this wasn't about who he had been. It was about who he was about to become. Because the people who had built this lie had underestimated one thing. He wasn't just their loose end. He was their biggest mistake. And now, he was going to burn it all down. The city stretched out before him, a sea of flickering lights and restless movement. But James had never felt more apart from it. He stood at the edge of a rooftop, the wind biting against his skin, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt. It had been 3 days since the warehouse. 3 days since he had pulled the trigger, since he had watched Chris, his best friend, his betrayer, fall to the ground with shock in his eyes. 3 days since he had left behind the last remnants of the life he thought he knew. Now, he wasn't James Carter. He wasn't the unsuspecting Groom, the man who had once believed in love, in normalcy, in control over his own fate. He was someone else, something else, an echo of a past he had never been allowed to remember, now reborn in the ashes of deceit. He exhaled, his fingers tightening around the small, untraceable phone in his hand. A burner. A new identity. It had been left for him in a safety deposit box, one final parting gift from the people who had been pulling his strings for years. They had given him a choice: disappear, become someone else, live in the shadows, or keep fighting, knowing that every step forward would be met with resistance, with more danger, with more blood. They hadn't expected him to take a third option. The screen lit up with a single message, an address, no name. No instructions, just coordinates leading him to another ghost from his past. He stared at it for a long time, his mind replaying everything that had brought him here. Natalie was gone. He had made sure of that. Not dead, he hadn't given her that mercy. Instead, he had exposed her, left behind the kind of evidence that would ensure she could never manipulate another man, never serve as a pawn in this game again. She was running now, looking over her shoulder for enemies she had once believed were allies. He had watched her disappear into the night, and for the first time, she had been the one afraid. But this wasn't just about her. It had never been just about her. Chris's last words still echoed in his mind, laced with regret, with resignation. "You were never supposed to wake up." The truth was, he hadn't. Not fully. He had glimpsed behind the curtain, but there were still more questions, more shadows lurking just out of reach. Why had his past been erased? Why had they let him live at all? Who had decided that he was safer as a ghost than as a corpse? The wind howled, cutting through him like a warning. He could walk away. He could take the new identity, bury the past, vanish into the quiet existence they had once forced upon him. He could leave the war behind, let the secrets rot with the people who had built them. But then he thought about the blood on his hands. Chris, the officers in the squad car, the men who had tried to erase him just as they had erased his past. He thought about every moment of betrayal, every whispered lie, every piece of his life that had been stolen before he even knew it belonged to him. No, walking away wasn't an option. He turned from the city skyline and started toward the rooftop exit, the phone still clutched in his palm. He didn't know what waited for him at the address in that message. Another trap, another secret, another enemy lurking in the dark. But it didn't matter, because this time he wasn't running. He was hunting, and whoever had started this was about to find out exactly what kind of mistake they had made.